Good afternoon, everyone. Bienvenue. Merci de votre patience et d'avoir pris le temps de vous joindre à nous aujourd'hui. Pour ceux et celles qui ne me connaissent pas, je m'appelle Monica Gattinger. I'm the director of the Institute for Science, Society, and Policy. Welcome to this final Food for Thought of the 2023 calendar year. We're going out with a bang with a session focused on a recently published book by the Institute, which is the fruit of a multi-year research project spearheaded by the Institute. L'événement se déroulera en anglais, mais si jamais vous avez des questions en français, soyez-vous bien à l'aise de les poser dans la langue de votre choix. We're going to begin with the University of Ottawa's Indigenous affirmation, and I encourage everyone to acknowledge the land from which they are joining us. We pay respect to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders past, present, and future. So again, encourage you to acknowledge the land from which you're joining us today. So before getting started with our event today, I wanted to just briefly introduce you to the ISSP for those who aren't familiar with it. We are a cross-faculty institute at the University of Ottawa, exploring the links among science, society, and policy. Our 5-year strategic vision is ambitious. It's to help Canada transform decision-making to meet the grand challenges of our time. At the Institute, we pursue this strategic vision by aiming to strengthen relationships among academia, business, government, Indigenous organizations, and civil society. The book we'll be discussing today, I think, is a nice illustration of that. We've got 3 key focus areas in our strategic plan: fostering public trust in expertise and expert-based decision-making, supporting co-production of government policies by government, business, Indigenous, academic, and civil society leaders, and weaving together technological and social innovation. And again, you're going to see those in focus in our session here today. So this is a second event in a series of book promotion panels for our book. I've got a copy here, hard copy here, Democratizing Risk Governance, Bridging Science, Expertise, Deliberation, and Public Values. The book has been published in open access by Palgrave, so feel free to have a look as we're going through the session today at the chapters, which are all available free of charge. This is the fruit of a multi-year research study. I'm going to begin by describing the study, and then we will hear from a number of our research team members who are joining us here today. So I think really the backdrop for this study is risk governance, and the issues that risk scholars and practitioners are grappling with when it comes to how best to govern risk in the face of growing calls and rationales for democratization of public decision making, the centrality of public trust to effective risk governance, the fragmentation of public perceptions of risk, and growing expectations for public involvement in risk decision making. This really characterizes the context for risk governance in the 21st century. And we certainly saw this in very visible ways with the COVID-19 global health pandemic. It really underscored the critical importance of public trust in risk decision making. The pandemic also made visible how perceptions of risk can differ among and between experts and the public, how public perceptions of risk are forever vulnerable to misinformation and disinformation, and the importance for governments of incorporating the views of citizens, communities, and stakeholders into their decision making. So against this broader backdrop, a number of years ago, the ISSP created the project At Risk, How to Strengthen Risk Governance in Canada. So this project At Risk aimed to advance scholarly and empirical understandings of public participation in risk decision-making, of ways to conceptualize and address differences in public and expert perceptions of risk, and ways to foster public trust in risk governance. The project brought together a very large and multidisciplinary research team. We had over 24 scholars and graduate students from 11 Canadian and US universities. The book involves many, many more authors beyond that. I think we've got almost close to 40 authors in total. And the project also included half a dozen senior practitioners, risk practitioners, from 5 partner organizations: the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, the Canadian Public Health Association, Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, the Genetic Engineering and Society Center at North Carolina State University, and the ISSP at UOttawa. We received funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council and Genome Canada through a partnership development grant, and the University of Ottawa's Faculty of Social Sciences also contributed. So we're very grateful for that support. We couldn't have completed the project without it. So central to the project, I mentioned the risk practitioners. Central to the project were practitioner members of the research team, one of whom is with us today, who gave generously of their time, their expertise, and their insights throughout the study to ensure that the research was grounded in and informed by the real worlds of risk governance. The project focused on 10 case studies in 3 policy areas: energy, public health, and genomics. And we started this project before COVID-19. So when we got to publishing the book, we also included a few chapters on COVID-19. We have one of our chapter authors on COVID-19 with us here today. The study also included cross-cutting research on the concept of motivated reasoning in risk governance. I'm going to speak to that in a moment. We also included a focus on science and engineering education tools for risk literacy. We have one of our authors here today to speak to that, and the entanglement between science and values. So as I've alluded to, our session today features both academic and practitioner members of the study's research team. They will share their analyses and their reflections on public participation and trust in risk decision-making, drawing on a number of detailed case studies. One on COVID-19 vaccination uptake in culturally and linguistically diverse communities. We have with us Professor Rukhsana Ahmed to speak to her chapter on that topic. And we have with us Professor Andrea Perrella, who will be speaking with us about municipal bans on water fluoridation that have come about due to public opposition to the practice, despite its safety being long demonstrated by science. Running through the panel, you will hear, is this concept of motivated reasoning, which is an academic term to capture and draw attention to the ways in which values, identity, group belonging, experiences, and worldviews shape risk perception for the public, but also risk perception of scientists as well. The panel will also present a tool for science and engineering education. It's called the Bias-Free Framework. We have Professor Gregor Wolbring with us today, who has written a chapter on that. And the Bias-Free Framework helps to unmask inequities in decision-making for risk. So we hope that this session will help to bring forward some of the promise, prospects, challenges, concepts, tools, and techniques when it comes to democratizing decision-making for both researchers and practitioners. So as I've mentioned, we've got 3 of our authors with us today: Rukhsana Ahmed, who is a professor in the Department of Communication, University at Albany at the State University of New York. She's also a faculty affiliate with the Institute for Science, Society, and Policy. We have Andrea Perrella, who's a professor at the Department of Political Science, Wilfrid Laurier University. We have Professor Gregor Wolbring, who is a professor in the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Calgary, also a senior fellow at the ISSP. And we have with us Dr. Bob Walker, who was one of the most engaged, I would say, of our senior practitioner members on the research team. Bob is a senior fellow at the ISSP, formerly senior executive many years, and notably in the federal government, formerly president and CEO of Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, of Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, among multiple other organizations. So without further ado, we're going to hear some opening remarks from each of our panelists, and then we'll move into a discussion. So Rukhsana, we will start with you.
Thank you very much. Excuse me, Monica. Greetings, everyone. It is a pleasure to participate in this panel. with other panelists, and also an honor to represent our chapter led by a team at the University at Albany. So I would start by recognizing that the U-Albany community recognizes that we live and work on the homelands of sovereign indigenous nations with rich histories and cultures that continue today, both within New York and beyond. So as you know, we have heard from Monica about the background of the publication that we have in the book. I want to start by contextualizing that a number of conditions must exist so that members of culturally and linguistically different communities can effectively consume health information. And also they can contemplate health decisions. They can motivate themselves to take action to improve health and act on to make informed health decisions. And these factors have been also come across as very important in the backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic that we experienced. So for the chapter, we examined the role of information sources in COVID-19 vaccine decision-making among 4 called communities. Again, just to reiterate, it's the acronym for culturally and linguistically different communities. And the 4 communities included the Arabic-speaking community, the Bengali-speaking community, the Chinese-speaking community, and Spanish-speaking community in the US. So for the purposes of today's panel, I will just share a few insights on the top sources of the health information for vaccinated and intended to be vaccinated members across the 4 called communities that became apparent. They included digital media in those communities' native language, ethnic TV and radio channels, social media platforms, and also friends and family. So I will end my opening remarks by asking, how can we increase health promotion and risk reduction in call communities? So a few conditions must be met. Those include targeting digital and social media platforms, targeting ethnic media outlets, engaging local community leaders, increasing capacity of community-based organizations, and most importantly, we need to refrain from one-size-fits-all approach. And I will stop there, and I'll be happy to, engage in the discussion and also answer any questions that the panelists the audiences might have. Thank you.
That is terrific, Rukhsana. There's a lot in the last few things that you said that I really want to unpack when we get to the discussion portion. Raises so many, I think, interesting prospects and possibilities, but also I think challenges as well in terms of sort of reframing how we think about organizations, risk-based organizations. What sorts of tools, techniques, mechanisms do they need to be developing capacity to deliver? So we'll turn to Andrea Perrella now. Andrea.
Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me for this panel. It is an honor. I'm speaking to you from Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Ontario, the home of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people. And I am happy to be here with you today. I've got a few slides that I'd like to show. I don't know if that is possible. I see that the screen sharing has been disabled. If that is not possible, I'll just speak to them. Although I do have some charts, I'm not too sure how easy it is for me to speak about the colorful charts that I've prepared.
Why don't we see if it's possible to get screen sharing turned on? On my side, I can do it, but I guess for whatever reason, it hasn't been enabled on your side. If you're able to flip those to us also by email, perhaps, Andrea, we can share them on our side for you.
I shut my email off, so it wouldn't signal every time I receive an email. But I can speak to it fairly generally. Nothing too complicated about that. And when it came to our study of water fluoridation, we were motivated. By asking, why are we still talking about this? So after 50 plus years, 70 years, or why is it still a controversy? And what we find is that overall, it's not. Overall, people are in favor of water fluoridation. When you ask them, when they're surveyed, support for fluoridation is upwards past 50%, 60, 70, past 80%, higher even. So it's not a practice that is overwhelmingly opposed. But when the people are asked and to engage in a campaign or in a referendum about it, that's when things start to go sour for water fluoridation. And we tested that in the Burke chapter. We tested that in an experimental survey model where we randomly assigned people to various narrative frames, various prompts. Some of them are factual, such as that water fluoridation or a certain amount of water, a certain amount of fluoride in water can prevent tooth decay in the amounts of 0.7 milligrams per liter. We also included a fact that is not very favorable, that the risk of skeletal fluorosis rises when people consume 10 milligrams of fluoride a day over 10 years. And by the way, that's a lot of fluoride over a long period of time, but I'm not too sure how many people can actually connect those dots. Then we included some what we call moral frames, like one of them that should have supported water fluoridation is that low-income children are often at risk of getting cavities because their family cannot afford dental care. So this idea that putting fluoride in water is a public good, it can help those, especially those who cannot see a dentist. And another moral frame, this one is more negative, is that governments sometimes add medicines or chemicals in our drinking water without people's consent. So as you can imagine, these various frames should move public opinion one way or the other. And what we find is, number one, no matter what frames people are subjected to, support declines. And this is like a very tense family gathering where nobody's talking, and as soon as somebody says, "How was your day?" it becomes an argument. And this is what it seems like the water fluoridation controversy seems like a topic that is best left not discussed. As soon as we start talking about it, support dwindles, especially when people are exposed to more than negative frames, about potential for bone disease or the government's intrusive practices. And what we find is that there's not a whole lot to raise it. It's not like the positive frames are able to elevate support. It's that support will more likely decline. And we looked at it through a variety of different means. And what we're finding is basically that this is a topic, this is a public health practice, as you pointed out, that is well established, that it is safe, it is cheap, it is inexpensive. And it is not some conspiracy. Fluoride naturally occurs in water. That's how they discovered that it can prevent tooth decay. That some communities have healthy teeth and some communities don't. And scientists wondered, what's with that? It's in the water. And so it is a long established safe practice that is probably best left untouched in the public realm if you want to keep it. And this is what we concluded, that there are some public health practices that are probably best left out of a public discourse. Otherwise, people get riled up, especially those who, for various other reasons, may be opposed to water fluoridation, either for libertarian reasons or they believe in its toxicity, and they can mount a very effective negative campaign. But on the positive side, that is unlikely to happen. People are not likely to mount a positive campaign to support water fluoridation. Again, it's like sidewalks, they're there. And no one's going to argue in favor of keeping them. But as soon as they're removed, then we may notice it. So it is one of those issues that, again, as much as I believe in democracy, as much as we all believe in democracy, maybe some issues are best left not in a democratic realm. And that is our conclusion from our chapter.
Thanks, Andre. That's a tough pill to swallow, pardon the connection to the water fluoridation. Again, lots of questions, topics that I'd love to ask you to unpack a little bit more for us. I think the other thing that I found fascinating about your chapter was limitations of some techniques that people will turn to try to resolve these issues, and in particular, in the context of your chapter, the use of municipal referenda or plebiscites on specific practices. So just heads up, I'm going to come back to you on that one, because I found that to be extremely just illuminating in terms of sort of what are the different mechanisms that we should be using when it comes to addressing some of these controversial issues, and then maybe what are some of their limitations, and in what instances are they, best not to be used. So we're going to move over to Gregor now, and hear from Gregor about the bias-free framework, and sort of take a step back from individual case studies to look at, as we're learning more about these emerging practices and important issues in risk governance, what does this mean for how we should be reforming educational practices when it comes notably to those in science, technology, and engineering and math? So Gregor, over to you.
Oh, thank you, Monica, and thanks for having me. For the book, for the project, and for this presentation. I'm located at the University of Calgary, which is on the traditional territory of the peoples of Treaty 7. And the city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, District 5 and 6. And I'm also on the Tsuut'ina First Nation. Science literacy includes the ability to critically think about the interactions between science, technology, society, and the environment, risk perception and risk narratives. And Monica already alluded to that. Social and civic literacy is one goal of science literacy. Science museums, for example, are involved in increasing scientific literacy so that its visitors can participate in decision-making, understand social and environmental responsibilities, and can engage in socio-political actions. Bill C-27, which is under consultation in the moment with the federal government, includes as Part 3 the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act. And under the header Measures Related to Risk, it states, the person who is responsible for a high-impact system must, in accordance with the regulation, establish measures to identify, assess, and mitigate the risk of harm or biased output that could result from the use of the system. The problem, especially in education, is, but in general, how do people know what they don't know? Tools are needed that people can use by themselves to make visible biases, premises, and positionalities in science and society discourses, including risk narratives, and to increase the sensitivity and literacy of people related to existing biases, premises, and positionalities in discourses and in oneself. We know many problems exist in relation to marginalized groups, including disabled people around science coverage. For example, the hierarchy of imagery of disabled people, such as the medical imagery being the dominant one versus the non-dominant social one, deaf culture, neurodiversity, has been recognized for some time. The bias-free, the long name is Building an Integrative Analytical System for Recognizing and Eliminating Inequities framework was developed by Marianne Burke and Margaret Eichler for identifying and avoiding biases derived from social hierarchies. Social inequity and the bias surrounding them can be divided into three distinct sets of problems, namely maintaining an existing hierarchy, failing to examine differences, and using double standard. As to maintaining hierarchy, it presents itself in accepting hierarchies as natural, denying hierarchy exists, adopting the perspective of the dominant group, applying the norms of the dominant groups to non-dominant groups, objectifying specific persons or groups, pathologization, victim blaming, and appropriation. Failing to investigate differences presents itself in the insensitivity to differences, decontextualization, overgeneralization or universalization, and assumed homogeneity. Using double standard is about over double standard, underrepresenting or exclusion, exceptional underrepresentation or exclusion, denying agency, treating dominant opinions as fact, stereotyping, exaggerating differences, and hiding double standard. All of that allows, right, that the bias-free framework can unmask biases and right social hierarchies in many different areas, many different sources, from science textbooks to science education, so how we teach, media, right, in general, for example, but any, like our podcast, and so on. It can also unmask ability expectation hierarchies, which is not a social group, but it's also a hierarchy. There are many ability expectations that are evident in discourses around scientific and technological advancement, whereby which abilities we are pursuing depends on who is the dominant group shaping the discourses. Ability expectations influence science and society discourses, and as such, being literate on the dynamic of ability expectations is an important aspect of science and society literacy. Right? We can also, of course, use it to, like how we use the term risk. The term risk is often used as a descriptor without giving it a second thought, accepting dominant narratives. To give one example, the phrase risk of having a child with Down syndrome is often used in the context of women having pregnancies at an increasing age. However, risk is a judgment, not a fact. One has a higher probability of having a child with Down syndrome at higher age of becoming pregnant. However, the term probability or similar factual terms are much less used. Conclusion. The bias-free framework is a useful tool to make visible biases, premises, and positionalities in science and society discourses, including risk narratives, and to increase the sensitivity of people to look for such biases, premises, and positionalities, adding to the democratization of science and technology governance and risk governance. The bias-free is available for free online, so anyone can use this in any settings, including teaching. Thank you.
Thank you, Gregor, and appreciate your mentioning that it's available for free online, and also certainly the chapter that you've authored for the book gives a bit of the context and applications, and so many rich opportunities with the framework. So I'm looking forward to circling back with a few questions for you on that. For now, let's turn to Bob. So Bob, you've been a senior practitioner, as we referred to them, on this project, and really just been engaged with this study from the outset, engaged with the ISSP for many years. And I can imagine there were times where you kind of sat through some of our more academic moments and had your questions. But I think we'd be really interested to hear from you, Bob, as a practitioner. What were your experiences with this project? But also, what do you see as somebody who's lived, the really hard job of making risk-based decisions? What are some of the things that have emerged from this study that practitioners should be thinking about integrating into their daily lives?
Well, thanks very much here, Monica. It's a real pleasure to be here today and following on my colleague's perspective. Perhaps to begin, just to acknowledge that I, like Monica, come from Ottawa on the traditional and non-ceded territories of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. What I want to do in my very brief remarks is to pull some threads, as Monica has suggested, from what we've heard from our colleagues who just presented, as well as what I learned through the At-Risk Project, to briefly explore the following question. And how can the voice of science better contribute to the mitigation of risks to public policy durability? And what am I talking about? Well, over the lifetime of a public policy, society develops various perspectives on the merits of that policy. Is it necessary? Does it appropriately balance risk with rewards? Is it effective? Is it equitable? Is it just? Perspectives, as science, such as you've just heard, tells us, that are shaped by our motivated reasoning, by activism and political discourse, by the echo chambers of social media, And at some point, enough negative perspectives may accumulate across communities to lead to a policy failure, or in extreme, to a political failure contributing to a change in government. Now, I'm not suggesting here that a policy failure is necessarily a bad thing, but what I would suggest is that durable public policy is indeed a public good. So, to the voice of science or science-based evidence in informing public policy decision-making, can we do better? And I want to just draw a few examples that are teased out in the research that At Risk has produced of where there may be possibilities. So first, I suggest that we come to that mantra of evidence-based decision-making and the role of the voice of science. And I would say that a voice is typically biased towards informing policymakers on the need for a public policy intervention. Wearing masks reduces the risk of COVID infections. The North Atlantic cod stocks are nearing collapse. All good. But where the voice of science is perhaps less heard by policymakers or perhaps is not ready to be heard is when it comes to the choices regarding policy implementation, particularly with this eye on what I call policy durability. In short, how to implement policies that take due account of considerations such as effectiveness, equity, justice, and so on, and how to ensure that effective public engagement along the way that helps sustain public trust and confidence. Wow, are those big questions. And it's not that our science community is not doing world-leading research in such areas. They are. You've just heard about it. We need research that helps us understand where policies are failing or challenged, such as Yasmina and Andrea have highlighted. And we need to translate this evidence into the upstream advice, the lead indicator, such as Gregor's bias-free framework, that can point to what will help achieve durable policy implementation. And I, for one, feel that this opens important considerations regarding the how and the when of science voice in policy decision-making. Now, as a second example, let's look at what I refer to as the public policy risk cascade. And what do I mean by this? Well, the systems on which our society depends are interdependent. We know this. A consequence is that efforts to mitigate risks, say to public health or to the environment, in one dimension may increase risk in another. And the COVID pandemic has made this risk cascade a top of mind concerns for lawmakers and regulators, for businesses, for societies more generally. From a public health perspective, protection of the public from contracting and spreading and potentially dying from the virus has been the top priority. But we also know that the policy interventions to achieve this public good have also had dire cascading consequences for the economy, for students' education, for a society's mental health. And that's with a highly disproportionate impact on marginalized communities. So yes, science had a strong voice in the policy options regarding public health. And I contend that science had a much diminished voice in the public policy choices to address the resulting risk cascade. How can we do better going forward? And just briefly, finally, let's look at the role of science, the Canada science and technology community to better support public policy, and particular in responding to the negative societal and economic disruptions that we get from emerging technologies. Think AI. And certainly that notion that our science and technology community is an important enabler to our social and economic well-being, it's there, it's no debate. But can the community better serve the needs of society and the economy when it comes to the governance of risk related to the societal downsides of technology? After all, the many of those risks that we now face had their origins in the technology emerging from the science and technology community, but it's perhaps been too often the case that it's not until these technologies have emerged at scale and deployed into markets and society that we've discovered those negative consequences. Think of anthropogenic climate change. And who uncovers the evidence? Well, it typically is the same science and technology community, though often not through the same disciplines, which comes to my core message here, that stated another way, it's about doing better than this science, than technology, and the science model for addressing this risk-benefit calculus for potentially disruptive technologies. And so perhaps the idea is to look at the paradigm that favors more multidisciplinary scientific inquiry that helps foresee these potential negative consequences before the at-scale deployments proceeds. So there's a few ideas here, Monica, to stimulate the discussion, but these are all rooted in the findings of at-risk. There's a rich content here. Now we need to engage public policy decision makers in the so what. Back to you.
Great. Thanks. Thanks so much, Bob. Very eloquent and insightful remarks. I think, what I find really interesting about what you've just said is almost sort of breaking things down into different elements of the public policy cycle and the role for science across those different stages of policy making, and maybe, to your point about interdisciplinarity or multidisciplinary model, it's different kinds of science at different stages, right? I'm mindful today that some of the discussions that we're having, which are really about implementation, it's social scientists around this table. So what we've got lots of time for questions. I'd like to invite all of those who are with us here today, listening in, to please use the Q&A function. If you've got a question, I would be delighted to put it to our panelists. And maybe while folks are getting warmed up, don't be shy. Please do chime in. Perhaps while folks are thinking about a question, maybe I can kind of start with one here, which, in this environment of very different, in many instances, perceptions of risk. Sometimes they are very much shaped by this concept of motivated reasoning. So people's, their values, their worldviews, their experiences, their identity commitments, these are not irrationally held perceptions of risk. In many instances, they are perceptions of risk that are coming through the individual lens, to Rukhsana's point earlier about no one size fits all. But in that kind of environment, how can we build bridges between, whether it's sectors or people or communities, or disciplines? And happy to just kind of throw that open to all of you. And if nobody jumps in, I'll direct the conversation to one of you to get us started. Yeah, go ahead, Bob. And then I was going to go to Rukhsana, because when I think about your research, I think about this being very, very, core to that work. So Bob, and then Rukhsana.
Well, I think you really captured a key message, and some of the comments Andrea made as well reflect back on this. My sense is our society struggles very, very much these days in being able to have respectful but difficult conversations. And whether it's around the family table or it's within, public policy making, whether it's engaging multiple communities to get their input around decisions required, it seems that we invariably get polarized too quickly and stop listening to each other. And I, for one, would welcome feedback from the social sciences communities of how to do this, and would also reflect that perhaps our universities, in its historical strength, needs to even up its game more of creating neutral spaces for difficult conversations.
That's very interesting, Bob, and it makes me think there's a chapter in the book, and in fact, in our first panel for the book promotion, Kieran O'Doherty, who organized a series of discussions, again, using that convening power of the university, around childhood vaccination and, the whole contentious topic of, should it be mandatory? If so, what are the conditions? Bringing together people consciously with very different points of view for precisely, as you said, Bob, those, respectful conversations on really difficult topics. So would certainly encourage people, if they're interested in that, to have a look at that chapter. Rukhsana, what's your perspective?
Yes, I think I want to approach this from the perspective of informed decision making. But even before that, I think I also want to highlight the importance of information equity. So, which is the fair or reasonable distribution of information among individuals, groups, regions categories or other social units, such as, those people have the opportunity to achieve whatever is important or meaningful to them in their lives. And I think in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and the vaccination and, in the obviously our chapter, I think the dimensions of health information equity is important. So especially as the call communities are concerned, reliable and plain language health information remains accessible. So we want to ensure that. And we also want to ensure that it remains affordable for making important health decisions.
Great. Thank you, Rukhsana. And maybe just a quick follow-up, if I could. You had talked in your opening remarks about, the need for capacity building, amongst called organizations. Could you speak to that maybe a little bit? What might that look like?
Yes, of course. So, because a lot of times, what happens is, there's this information inequity. And why? Because there's lack of access to accurate, understandable, linguistically and culturally adapted public health promotion materials from authoritative sources, for example, official government sources. And we have seen that during the pandemic. Also, there is limited access to health services, language barriers, and low digital and health literacy. And also, we have witnessed lack of trust in institutions and government, like healthcare systems. So in this case, the trained local community champions can be an important information point. So oftentimes, members of call communities look up to opinion leaders, and they can be trained and to promote these health messages that will help the members of call communities to make important health decisions.
That's great. Thanks, Rukhsana. I see we have a question, but I also see that Gregor turned on his microphone. Gregor, did you want to respond to the question before we move to a question from the audience?
No, you can go to the audience.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. Well, we'll come to you then. How about with the audience question? So there's an audience question here that's asking, thank you, or that's saying first, thank you for the stimulating presentation. On behalf of the group here, I'll say you're welcome. Thank you for the compliment. And here's the question, do you have any anecdotes on the idea of wisdom in risk governance spaces? How do people conceive of it and practice it? Who holds it? Gregor, can we start with you on that one? What do you think?
Well, I'm not so sure whether this is about the risk governance, but for me, if a student is literate on a topic, they can be part of the risk governance discourse. And students are supposed to be active citizens, right? So should be part of the risk governance discourse. And I give the bias-free to the students in year 1 of their undergraduate degree. And it's just, normally the feedback is once they filled out, they have to come up with an example for each of the 20 questions. And they already see, if I, for example, would limit it to disabled people, they could not come up with an example for most of them. So they then use all kinds of groups so that they can fill it out. And that shows them what they don't know. It triggers a lot of stuff simply where they make a lot of assumptions. And then they can use that knowledge and that document simply to go into any source, right, to really audit it, to really interrogate it. And if you use that bias-free on a routinely basis, I think that will increase the literacy a lot, which makes them a much better active citizen in the risk governance discourse.
Great. Thank you, Gregor. Andre, would you like to weigh in on that one? If not, I have a question for you. So
I'd love to hear your question, but it is in terms of information. I think we've reached a point now where we no longer have a public that is ready to defer to what we may define as authentic, accurate information. Right now, it's a bit of an information free-for-all. So that's the challenge about information as a basis for what we're talking about. But go ahead, I'd love to hear your question.
I know, great. Thanks, Andre. You concluded your remarks by saying you don't want to, or I'm paraphrasing here, not that you're against democracy, that it can sound kind of, a little bit anti-democratic. So how do we, I think it's a very interesting conclusion that you and your co-authors came to. And I think, the chapter is really fascinating from that perspective, because many of the chapters in the book are talking about the promise of democratizing risk decision-making, the mechanisms to go about doing that. What are some of the tools and techniques? What are the benefits? How is this good for democracy, better for decision-making, leading to better decisions, and on and on and on. Your chapter, you and your co-authors chapter, and there are another couple of chapters as well that are really, looking at, well, what are the limitations of democratizing risk decision making? And so I'd love to get your thoughts. I know you do research on a whole host of different topic areas that are controversial. Are you seeing the same sorts of challenges in other topic areas? And if so, how do you sort of discern those that don't lend themselves to constructive policy debate?
Well, in the case of fluoride, that's a technical debate. I don't think we engage in debates on the chemical nature of asphalt, but we could. And then we'd have maybe some groups opposing asphalt, and we'd have gravel roads. This is, maybe it's an exaggeration, but this is a very technical, a very chemistry debate. And unless the public is educated in a particular technical field, I'm not too sure they're able to comment on the validity of a practice, especially when they don't have the full array of all of the challenges that face a government. It's not just this one thing, but a whole bunch of things, a whole bunch of different publics that need to be considered whenever any kind of policy is enacted. So that is complicated. And again, I'm not too sure how well equipped the public is, but maybe not just the public. I'm not sure the arena. I'm not too sure how well equipped the arena is in providing for that. And I'm including journalists here in the media. I'm not too sure that they may not necessarily be complicit in peddling ignorance, but they're certainly not. They don't feel like it's their responsibility to educate the public. Their job is to be a facilitator of the transmission of different opinions and information. Fine, but there's another matter, and even when the information is out there, and even when it's accurate, it doesn't mean the public will follow along. It's not just build it and they will come. And yes, I am working on a bunch of other projects, and one of them has to do with reconciliation in Canada with the Indigenous people. And almost 10 years since the publication of the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, what has happened? And we're looking into that because not a whole lot has happened. The information is out there. We know about the atrocities. Most Canadians agree that Canada committed cultural genocide. But then what? Not much. So that then may point to some other deep-rooted resistance in terms of values, as opposed to not being a chemist, where you may learn chemistry and then realize that fluoride is not so bad. But when it comes to other aspects of policy, we're talking about values. And values are personality. It's what we grew up with. It's what we were socialized into. That's a little harder to deal with. Again, public deliberation can be a challenge, and not just for the regular people, even professionals, experts. They bring their values to the same field. So there are limitations. I think we need to rethink democratic or the ways in which we engage democratically. Believe me, I'm not opposed to democracy. I'm nowhere near in favor of any kind of authoritarian regime, but we can't just expect all peoples in all different domains to be equally capable of engaging in a topic.
Yeah. No, thanks for that, Andre. And we actually have another question that has just come in that I think really aligns quite well and is a nice follow-on to your remarks. And I'll certainly want to turn to the other members of the panel as well. I know Rukhsana well enough to know she has a different view. And so I'm really keen to hear her thoughts, and perhaps Gregor as well. That was one of the most, I think, the most rewarding and I don't know, I hesitate to use the word productive, but one of the most interesting parts of this project was that the researchers and the practitioners, we didn't always agree. there were some, pretty healthy debates, but I think we tried to mobilize those tensions into better research for all of us. So the question that we've got here is from, and I'm going to name the person because it's he's a senior fellow here with the Institute, Nigel Cameron. Hello, Nigel. Thank you for joining us. So Nigel says, plainly, I need to read the book. So yes, please do go read the book. Nigel, would love to hear your thoughts. So here's his question. In so many areas, we as individuals or governments need to make decisions under conditions of risk, whether the agenda is climate or AI or pandemic control. Yet, our democratic processes focus on essentially binary choices, playing on our inbuilt inclinations to see everything either up or down. Is there evidence of the growth of more sophisticated thinking on the part of individuals or indeed governments? Now, I do definitely want to go to Rukhsana with this, but I also know, Gregor, you have to leave us within a minute or two. Would you like to say a few, 30 seconds on this before having to hop off?
Sure. I actually think I answered with the last one. I already answered that one because the students, once they use the bias-free a lot, they can think in totally different ways about any given source, any given question. This is not linked to a specific one. It's a general applicable tool, right? And the problem is we don't have enough tools where people can self-inform without others involved, where it triggers the neurons to make cross connections. And I think that is one of the tools who can do that. And the more you know, right? I mean, you have triggers, the more critical you can analyze stuff.
Right. Thank you, Gregor. And we know you're going to have to hop off here in a bit, so wanted to thank you very much for participating today.
Thank you.
I have to go to Rukhsana though, because I know Rukhsana's face well enough to know she has something she wants to share.
Thank you, Monica. It just goes to show that, how long we've known each other. So I guess, Andrea kind of alluded to this about the fact that we live in an information age society, and also following up on what Gregor had just said. I want to just remind us that, we have this infodemic, right? So too much information, including false or misleading information in this digital, physical environment, especially during a disease outbreak like the COVID-19 pandemic. So it causes confusion and risk-taking behaviors that can harm health. So it also leads to mistrust in health authorities and undermines the public health response. So I guess we need to, yes, there's this information, and the vulnerable and the marginalized in the society, they are more susceptible to the misinformation because A, they have lack of access to accurate information. B, especially when, linguistic barriers are concerned or cultural differences, the information is not adapted to their needs. So I guess, I guess that, we have a long way to go, and we need to work together and also we understand that resources are limited. So we need to come up with solutions and going back to, the previous question you asked me, Monica, about community-based organizations or information service providers, community leaders, they can be helpful. So digital literacy, health literacy, these are very, very important considerations that we need to have in an information age that we live in today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Rukhsana. So we have a few minutes left. Bob, any final reflections from you? We'll give you the final word before we close off for today.
So thanks for that here, Monica. And, the comment that Nigel made on, we seem to be in binary decision modes. And I think that's a very astute observation. And it perhaps is another view of my comment on the need for respectful, difficult conversations. And I'd say that the characteristic I'm observing in certainly in Western democracies, it seems all these debates are using political mechanisms to engage the dialogue, which by their very nature are polarized. And so my sense is that we need ways that step outside the political or the political attempt to gain advantage for political reasons in discourse and find ways of having the substantive discussions that somehow have depolarized the conversations. Public policy can be, you know, and Nigel wasn't suggesting this, but public policy can be quite sophisticated with multiple objectives achieved within it that meet the interests of multiple communities. So my sense is mechanisms that, again, come back to my theme, favor you know, respectful conversations on difficult topics is what we need more of.
Great. Thank you so much, Bob. So I want to, on behalf of the ISSP, thank all of the panelists for joining us today. Thank the attendees for joining us today. And read the book. I think it's been thrown into the chat, so everybody can see a link to the book. And so for our closing words today, I'm going to pass to Yasmina El Harim, who is our Communications and Research Administrative Assistant, without whom this event would not have been possible. So Yasmina, a big thank you to you as well. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Monica. So first of all, I would like to start by thanking our panel members and also authors and collaborators of the At-Risk project and book, Andrea, Gregor, Rukhsana, and Robert. Thank you so much. And of course, thank you, Monica, for moderating this interesting discussion. I want to thank our attendees online for taking the time to join us for this event. As mentioned, the At-Risk book is available in open access. You can find it in the link in the chat, as well as the ISSP website to learn more about our blogs. Hint, the latest one was authored by Dr. Rukhsana Ahmed, and you can also find our events and research projects. You can stay updated with the ISSP activities and network by subscribing to our monthly emails and following us on social media, also linked in the chat. Thank you once again for joining us. This concludes our latest Food for Thought for the 2022 and 2023 academic year. We wish you in advance happy holidays and a happy new year to all. Thank you.